Please welcome to the stage Humayun Tai, Adil Atlassi, Mark Christie, and James Lee.
Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody had a great time last night. I can't believe that this place that we are sitting in, right here, was actually turned over to a stage and a performance. It's pretty incredible how this whole venue has been turning out. I'm Humayun, I'm with McKinsey, and I have the pleasure of moderating this amazing panel. And if I think about the setup for the panel, yesterday we talked about the amazing transformation that AI is going to drive in society. Very good discussion around that, and how AI itself is transforming, meaning how are we getting faster around AI. We also talked about energy management. If you went through the different sessions during the day, as to how energy management is transforming with AI and getting us to a next stage. I think for this panel, what we'd like to do is move more upstream, which is really about power and electricity. Because to get all of this AI to transform us in this society, we actually need that power to be there. And as you know, it's a very complicated issue. A lot of headlines, a lot of discussions around what exactly needs to happen in the industry, both globally and in the US. And in a sector, which is the power and electricity sector, which is quite complicated. You've got federal, you've got regional, you've got state level jurisdictions, you've got different market structures. So we are very privileged to have Commissioner Christie, Adil, and James to help illuminate us, give us some thought around really, how do we see this power infrastructure unfold that then enables the AI transformation? So with that, maybe I'll start with a broader framing question, James, because we heard from technologists yesterday, we heard from engineers, but let's get the investor view, and that's the view you bring, is if you think about AI and the transformative force it is for society, and you're underwriting all these investments, what gives you the conviction and the sense, particularly in the backdrop of this bubble conversation of AI, that it's a force here for permanence and change, and it's investable?
All right, thanks, Humayun, and thank you to the Schneider team for inviting me to be a part of this panel this morning. For those that may be less familiar, GIP, a part of BlackRock, is one of the largest infrastructure managers globally, with 190 billion in assets under management. We recently formed an AI infrastructure partnership with MGX, Microsoft, NVIDIA, xAI, and some of our largest financial investors to invest in data center platforms and enabling power infrastructure. So we're clearly firm believers in the trend and investment opportunity in AI. But as we think about whether AI is investable and whether it's a bubble, I must admit there does seem to be quite a bit of hype in the market these days. So one story that comes to mind, given my Korean heritage, is last month Jensen Huang was in South Korea and met with the chairman of Samsung and Hyundai and had some fried chicken and beer. A photo of that gathering led to South Korean fried chicken-related companies trading up 20 to 30% the next day. So clearly that is some evidence of some hype. But if you look at AI in the main, we firmly believe that it is not a bubble and it's very investable. And that's because we have some very strong fundamentals that are supporting that investment. And while the valuation can seem a little high, that it is quite reasonable given the growth that's ahead. So maybe let me start with the strong fundamentals, which some of this has already come up in the conference. The first is rapid acceleration of adoption. I mean, there's lots of different data around, but from what we found, 71% of organizations are using Gen AI today for at least one business function. And that number a year ago was 33%. So you are seeing that very rapid acceleration. And then on top of that, that adoption is driving real revenue. So Gen AI-related revenues are expected to be about 150 billion in 2025, and the estimate is that it will grow to about $1 trillion by 2028. So you have real revenues, real growth in that revenue, and then the investment in AI is really supported by hyperscalers that have very healthy balance sheets and strong cash flow generation. And that strong fundamental is what supports this investment in AI. Touching on the valuation question, so the Magnificent Seven does trade at a high PE multiple of about 25 times on a 2-year forward basis. But this is really supported by the actual performance of real earnings growth and high return on equity, and an expectation that that earnings growth can accelerate, and it's doing that. But maybe as another data point, it's interesting to sort of look at, okay, where were the top 7 companies during the tech boom in early 2000 trading at? And that was more than double this multiple. So this is high but reasonable. And even if AI valuations were a little on the high side, we think the investment opportunity in data centers is highly attractive. And some people compare it to the massive overbuild of fiber in the late 1990s, and I think that's not warranted because the fundamentals and the dynamics are completely different. And that's because this is not speculative building, which is a lot of what that fiber was and what led to that bubble. The growth in data centers is supported by real revenues, real demand, and you've also got a dynamic where the demand can't be satisfied today with the supply. So maybe touching on the revenue and sort of demand point, if you look at the hyperscale customers, they have a revenue backlog of 2 to 3 times the current year in terms of real end user demand and revenues for the data centers. And 80% of the data centers that will be built over the next 5 to 7 years are really expected to be for cloud computing and for AI inference, which is really meeting that end user demand. And then on the demand and supply side, the demand for data centers significantly outweighs supply. And that's because we have real constraints on land, power, interconnect, water. So it's not easy to build a data center, and we're not able to satisfy all the demand that's there, and that's why you don't have room for speculative building. What you're doing is this investment is really backed by long-term contracts and real demand.
That's great. Some very nice markers that you draw out in the comparison with fibers. Very interesting, I think. But then let's go to what's getting in the way of accelerating the growth of data center demand, build-out. And Adil, you spend 24/7 thinking about this, dreaming about it probably, working on contracts. What's getting in the way? What are the major barriers here?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the Schneider team. This is probably my 5th Innovation Summit. It's always phenomenal. And I want to basically say thank you to the all people that are behind the scene making this happen. So thank you very much. What a pleasure to be on the stage with this panel. Compass Data Center is a owner, developer, and operator of data centers. What's getting in the way of the industry? Well, if I look at the industry, I've been, let's say, better be lucky than smart. Had the opportunity to be in the colocation business in the late 90s, lived through the birth of the wholesale data centers, and then seen the growth of the hyperscalers, and now the AI. So let me ask the audience, show of hands, who knew what AI was 5 years ago? So look around. 5 years ago, no one could even spell AI. So think about it just from a society perspective. We have gone through multiple industrial revolutions. One thing that those industrial revolutions have afforded us is time to absorb them as a society. The telegram, the internet access, went from dial-up, yes, I agree. It was a little slow, but eventually. As a society, it is very hard for you to fathom and wrap your head, not only from a performance perspective, from an execution, but also from a regulatory perspective, to pivot this rapidly. You take that and you compound it with a trajectory that's not even a hockey stick, it's a 90-degree curve. We have never seen that. So what's getting the ability for us to grow as an organization? Obviously, labor is a big one. So we're talking back in the GI Bill is one of the most beautiful things that happened to this nation. It's probably one of the worst things, because all of a sudden college become the minimum socially acceptable barrier. Trade school slowly but surely shrunk and disappeared. We don't have enough labor today, skilled labor, to be able to fulfill the demand. Take a data center in our project. At any given time, we can have upward of 400 to 500 people operating, 300 electricians. If you take that and compound it across all the projects happening nationwide, unfortunately, that's one of the biggest, in my view, decelerate from the growth. The second part, obviously, that's what we're discussing, is availability of power. So you've seen the growth of powers. We used to do, oh my God, 1.5 megawatt data hall, and we high-five each other. That was wow. Then we moved to a 10 megawatt data hall. Now we're talking about a campus. Now we're talking about gigawatt campuses. The acceleration has been astronomical. The power demand is such that the industry, from an energy perspective, utility companies, don't have enough time to react. One statistics, there were several studies, the last one from Duke, that shows that when the utility company do their projection, how much they need to build, they build for the peak demand. So think about it. If you look at the average consumption, it's about 50, 60% steady state. But for about 100 hours a year, I'm going to peak into that extra 40%. I call it the beer foam that sits there. So if we had the ability to work collaboratively with the utility companies to say, hey, we do have gigawatts of diesel backup generation that sits there that can contribute to the grid and alleviate a little bit of that pressure, we're happy to do it. Unfortunately, today, from an EPA and emission perspective, we cannot do it. It's a criminal offense if you go over your NOx and CO2 thresholds. So we're talking earlier with commissioners, and in Texas, a couple of years ago, we had that winter storm. We unfortunately lost 12 people. If the data center operator we were allowed to fire up their backup generation to absorb some of that demand, we probably could have saved some lives. So labor, power availability, the last but not least, just the regulatory construct today. We real estate developers, we do proffers all the time. We build parks, we build bridges, we build roads. One thing that we don't have the ability to do today is to go to utility companies and say, I will contribute $200 million to help you accelerate your growth. The current construct from a regulatory perspective is such that it's not feasible. So those are the 3 points that I want to mention: labor, availability, power, and obviously the regulatory construct.
Thank you. And so let's dig deeper into the power piece and the incentives piece with you, Commissioner Christie. I suspect you have a perspective on this. Mm-hmm. If you think about the power challenge that Adil is talking about, we think about actually what's required. And just based on estimates, what we need to build to meet the demand that's coming through is 3x the rate across generation, transmission, distribution than what we've historically done. So we've got this big issue around how do we build all of this.
Right.
In your view, when you think about the gap that we have, is this something that will get resolved through the way business gets done as usual at the state level, federal level? Or is this really a moment, not necessarily of crisis, but of challenge that requires new tools, new approaches?
Well, I think it's unprecedented what we face right now. And let me echo Adil and just, I want to thank Schneider for the invitation to be here and have this great discussion with these great co-panelists. And so I'm honored to be here. I spent 17 years as a Virginia regulator, state utility regulator, and as you know, Virginia is ground zero for data center development, not just for America, but for the planet. So we saw this coming in Virginia several years ago. Also spent 4.5 years as a federal regulator. And in answer to Humayun's question, the way I look at things as a regulator, and I'm not going to speak for all regulators, but as an electricity regulator, the way I look at things is there's 2 things I care about. Number 1 is a reliable system. And Americans think of reliability of the electricity system as 24/7, 365. That's what Americans expect in the electricity system. So I think of reliability. That's number 1 priority. And I also think about affordability, because you're on the political edge when you're a regulator, because if the bills are going up and the customers are complaining, they complain to the politicians complain to you, believe you me. All right, so we're facing 2 crises in America today. And I don't use the word crisis to be melodramatic. I use it because I think it's a factual description. The first crisis is in reliability. The second crisis is in affordability. So let me elaborate a little bit on each one. From a reliability standpoint, the crisis we face really comes down to, if you took Econ 101, it's supply and demand. Demand for power, which we call load in the lingo, is growing and has been growing for the last 5 to 6 years, has been growing much faster than the new generating resources that we're bringing online. So that's not a hard concept to understand. Demand is going up much faster than supply is going up. So obviously that leaves a gap. And that's causing reliability issues. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, just came out this week with their winter assessment and said in many regions of the country, the supply-demand situation is getting so tight that we're facing potential load shedding. That's the definition of not reliable. So we have that crisis. And so let me make the point too. As a utility regulator, I absolutely believe that we must serve all load. I don't believe in saying, well, large load users are causing this, let's find a way to cut them out of the system or something. And then political backlash, which in Virginia we're seeing pretty substantially, is targeting data centers. I don't believe in that. I think you serve all load. But you serve all load reliably, and you serve it fairly in terms of cost allocation. Now, and let me just say this. I've said this to crowds in Virginia asking about data centers. If you have one of these, and everybody in this room has one of these, I guarantee you. A lot of you have two of these, one for business, one for personal. Your kids have them. Your 80-year-old mother has it, okay? If you have one of these, you are building data centers. So let's not pretend that data centers came from Mars. We live life online. We have to serve that load. How we do it is the big question, and we're going to need a lot more generation to do it. The affordability issue is, Schneider's a French company, so I want to quote from a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he was a member of the French Parliament, right before the 1848 revolution in France, said to his fellow members of the French Parliament, "We are sleeping on a volcano." And I think in terms of the rise in power prices in America, we're sleeping on a volcano. And if we don't acknowledge that and make a focus on trying to control the price increases to customers, I think the political volcano is going to be extraordinarily dangerous. So with that, enough for now, and back to Humayun.
Well, I think, so let's pick up on these two themes of affordability and reliability, and maybe Adil, your perspective on the fact that there is a perception out there, when you think about the political realm of things, that the data center providers and builders are actually benefiting at the expense of residential other ratepayers. And that's the affordability side of it. And the reliability, similarly, that they're pulling power that should have been for the general population. What are the mechanisms available, and how do you kind of counter that perception? Because I think the facts are a little bit different, but how do you kind of approach that? And what are the mechanisms available that you can actually use to drive a different narrative in the system?
That's a very good question. I laugh when I hear that. I'm like, I would love to get power for free, but the reality is we have to pay for the infrastructure, and we pay $100 million, $150 million, $50 million for the privilege to be served. If anything, we actually contribute in all the area we go to actually provide more affordability, because we are contributing into the augmentation of the network. And by contributing so, we also contribute to the reliability of the network. When we build two substations of 500 of 250 megawatt each, we also are investing in the switching station upstream. We also, a lot of time, will go and work collaboratively with the utility company. We've done that in Texas, as an example. We've done that in Arizona, where their process to go get the right-of-ways to install the electrical poles will take them forever, because they are capped on how much they can pay per acre. Otherwise, they have to invoke eminent domain, and now you're going into 2-3 years before you can get that piece slipped in. So what we've done creatively, we want to secure those right-of-ways. We pay the premium multiple times, and we turn it over to utility companies, say, here it is. You can now put your own transmission poles on it to serve us. What we've also done is working with the utility company to give them visibility into what our load profile look like, so they can absorb that into their planning and have the ability. But I want to double click on my comment earlier. The capacity is built to accommodate peak demand. Call it 100 hours. If we were allowed to take our load off the grid, you can release 30-40% of capacity that's sitting idle there. You mentioned to talk about Ashburn, Virginia. Could we say there's about what? 3-4 gigawatt of data centers?
There's a lot.
Yeah. If they were allowed to, during the peak hours, call it 30, 40, to take the load off the grid, not only will provide an intermediary solution. I'm not saying this is the long-term solution. We need to build more capacity. There's no question about it. But in the interim, if we can just enable that capacity so we can leverage it and without affecting the rate payers, that would be a great solution. Today, as I said, we cannot, because there is a disjointment between the regulatory from an EPA emission limits, versus what you can do with utilities. I must say that it's very encouraging because we've been working with a lot of the southern companies. They are really forward-thinking and being creative, saying, oh, okay, what do we do that? And we call it a key pro quo. Hey, you're gonna help me to get the capacity, but in returns, I'm gonna help you by investing into your distribution. The other piece as well is we have, which is not uncommon, privately built transmission lines. Commissioner, it will take probably 5-6 years to get approvals for the route for the transmission lines. A lot of the private sector can operate and work much better. Last but not least, we are in the capital deployment business. We have no problem, as I said, writing checks and deploying capital to accelerate the ability to get more power. Unfortunately, this is not something that's doable from a regulatory perspective. We were talking backstage. In my view, this is a matter of national security. If we cannot produce energy to continue our AI race and win the race, we're going to have a problem from a society perspective. AI is not here to disappear. It is not a bubble. Like, you said earlier, it's about, 50% uplift in adoptions?
That's right, yeah.
Think about it. In 3 years, it's incredible. So it's here to stay. It's not going nowhere. The load demand is going to continue. The large data centers that continue to stay. And I think all we're asking is let the data center operator and developers to just sit down around the table and come up with creative means to solve the issue.
Which comes back to the whole ecosystem point that Amir was mentioning. This is a problem that takes different sides of the table to push. But maybe getting the investor lens, James, in this, because I think investors have been more creative around carving deals around data centers to mitigate this issue of affordability and reliability, these perceptions. Maybe just your thoughts on what are those mechanisms you're thinking about or you're seeing as an investor? How do you address those issues?
Yeah. So look, I think as I answer this question, we've got the perspective of as a data center investor and also as an investor in electric utilities. And we can come at this from both ways. And time's short today, so I'll sort of mention two things. One is from the data center side, as Adil mentioned, I do think being able to have data center demand, facilitating it to become more flexible can really add to both reliability and affordability. So that could be the backup power, the diesel generators that these data centers have, but on top of that, you could add like microgrids. So microgrids, we've already talked about it today, or yesterday, about like whether it can be a bridge to grid-connected power, it could supplement grid-connected power, but there's also an element of it can really add a lot of reliability benefits for those data centers and allow that data center demand to be much more flexible. And that could mean in those peak hours that we were talking about, taking the data center offline and running off the microgrid to be able to relieve that stress on the system, but also to use the capacity that you have in the microgrid to a participated demand response. And especially in PJM, where capacity prices have gone up significantly because of so much growth in demand and the ability to not grow the capacity as quickly, a significant increase in demand response, that can be mandatory, that can be firm, so we need to change the way the demand response would work. And for those data centers to participate can have a pretty big impact on both reliability and affordability. From an electric utility perspective, so as an investor in electric utilities, one area that we're sort of focused on is grid-enhancing technologies. These are efficient ways for us to optimize the capacity of the grid, to increase service levels and reliability, and ultimately end up reducing rates for our customers. So one example of a GET, with grid-enhancing technology, that we're focused on is dynamic line rating, so DLR. What it is it's a software tool that's coupled with sensors on transmission lines where you're taking real-time wind data, weather conditions, line sag, to dynamically update what the capacity of that transmission line is. for most of the transmission lines in the US right now, it's on a different approach, which is called the static line rating, which I'm sure a lot of people here know, where you take the worst case conditions and set the maximum limit of the transmission line based on that, on a hot day that's sunny with no wind, right? So on that day, clearly that is the capacity. But if you do dynamic line rating, especially when you have a windy day where it's cold, in storms that we've been talking about, where that demand does peak, you will get significant increases in that transmission capacity. So by implementing DLR, not only are you able to, in those times, increase reliability, you can also reduce congestion costs, and ultimately, DLR can facilitate renewable generation, especially wind, coming on a lot quicker in terms of the interconnect, because when it's windy, that's when you have the higher line capacity from a DLR perspective, and can also help sort of avoid or significantly defer transmission upgrade CapEx, which can have affordability benefits as well.
Fascinating. So these are solutions that are existing right now, and there's a question around how do you get those deployed?
That's right.
Maybe just one thing, Commissioner Christie, I want to come back to affordability. There is this discussion and narrative around affordability and the link to tariffs. Mm-hmm. Maybe your thought around the tariffs and the tariff regimes that are changing contribute to the affordability issue?
Yes, and let me elaborate. The utility industry, as many of you in here know, is a very capital-intensive industry. What we would call CapEx, capital expenditures, is a huge part of what ultimately ends up in your monthly power bill as a residential consumer. So when tariffs are put in the raw materials that are used in utility assets, let's take copper, let's take steel, let's take aluminum. When tariffs are put on those raw materials that are used in utility assets, that cost is going to be passed through to the end user retail customer, because most utility assets in America are paid for through what's called a cost of service mechanism. And the utility gets to recover dollar for dollar its costs plus a return. So if you're putting 10 or 15 or 20 or 30%, you don't know from hour to hour, tariff on these raw materials, it shows up in customers' bills. And I'll give you a specific example from Virginia. So Dominion, which is our largest utility, had their earnings call a couple of weeks ago, quarterly earnings call. And they reported that for their offshore wind project, called Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind, the price just went up several percentage points because of tariffs on steel. And that, you can argue pro or con, but that project is being rate-based, which means the tariff cost becomes a dollar for dollar cost to Virginia customers. Let me make one more point, too, about affordability, and I think this is a bigger picture issue. When I talk about power prices in America and we're sleeping on a political volcano, let's understand something about America. We don't have a national power price. We have 50 prices of power. Yep. The prices that consumers are paying in Georgia, Florida, are very different and very lower, much lower, than what consumers are paying in New York and California. State policies matter, and they matter a lot. And I'll use one more example. In PJM, which I'm extraordinarily familiar with because I've lived in PJM world for 21 years, some states 20 years ago made a decision to do what they call restructuring. New Jersey was one of them. I'm going to use that for example. By restructuring, what those states said was, they told their utilities, you cannot own generation, you cannot build generation. You have to go to this thing called the capacity market, and you have to buy all of your generating capacity. Well, as you know, or maybe you don't know, but people in New Jersey know, the last two auctions in the capacity market have set all-time highs. So New Jersey power prices to customers, I'm talking about retail prices, went up 20% overnight last June because of the capacity market results. That became a big issue in the governor's race. And it illustrates my point that, now there are other states in PJM that are not exposed to the capacity market that way. So my point is, we don't have one national price, we have 50 prices, and state policies mean a lot. Let's just not look at the federal level. State policies make a big difference. But I'm telling you, the political volcano from rising power prices is, like Tocqueville said to his fellow French parliamentarians, we're sleeping on a volcano, and we've got to address that. While we address the reliability issues and we address what we have to do to serve large load customers and build the generation, we cannot forget that what retail customers are paying is going to be a huge part of this, because if we ignore it, the volcano will blow up, and believe me, the consequences could be very bad.
Thank you. I think, James, maybe one last question to you in the interest of time. If you think about where this is all going, because you're underwriting the thesis of this investment in this industry for the long term, how does this all come together? Because we talk about the volcano, we talk about the reliability issues, we talk about untapped solutions which are not yet getting implemented, some of the misaligned incentives that Adil was talking about. But as you're underwriting this, what's your hope is one thing, what's your view of how this sort of evolves over the short term and long term?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let me pull out my crystal ball and what's going to happen in the long term. But look, as I think about how what we can do and where things are headed in the long term, I'll probably touch on two phrases that seem to be coming up a lot during this conference. One is all of the above, and the other is ecosystem. So by all of the above, I mean there is a significant amount of generation and transmission capex that is happening already from the utilities. Right? If you look at 2025, investor-owned utilities, their total capex has gone up 40% relative to 2022 when ChatGPT was introduced. And that is expected to go up another 20% by 2030. If you look at just generation capex for utilities, that has gone up 60 to 70% when you compare 2022 to 25. So that investment is happening, but I think that investment by itself is not enough. And we can't just solve this through gas-fired power plants. It needs to be an all-of-the-above solution on baseload power. And I think the other objective of not only do we want to provide the power for data centers, but make it be sustainable and clean over time, these other technologies need to come into play as well. So it can be gas plants with carbon capture. It can be next-generation geothermal, which allows geothermal power to be much more broadly applied, not just in the ring of fire. And nuclear, like all forms of nuclear, whether it's SMRs, whether it's AP1000s, whether it's restarts. And in all of this, we need all of the above. We need all of these to be able to meet the task at hand, to meet the significant growth in demand from data centers. And here, I think the ecosystem sort of comes in. And what maybe people don't quite appreciate is AI and hyperscalers are actually a key enabler of these newer clean baseload technologies. Whether it's nuclear, whether it's next generation geothermal, whether it's getting carbon capture on gas plants, they are leading the way by investing in a lot of these technologies, by providing long-term PPAs on a premium basis, where it really allows these early projects to push ahead because of having that anchor customer that has the demand and the ability to pay. And increasingly, I think they are playing an ecosystem role where they're bringing in utilities, EPC firms, financial investors like us, and OEMs, to really get together and see how we can solve these problems together and play the roles, whether from their perspective, it might be providing some development capital, it might be sharing some of the construction risks. I do think everything is on the table because this is such an important need. And together with this ecosystem, we'll be able to attack all of the above in terms of where all that generation is going to be coming from. But I am hopeful and sort of optimistic that we will get there.
Thanks, James. I mean, maybe a few points of synthesis as we close up. I think first is there's real conviction that this is permanent, investable area for AI for us to really drive transformation society. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think, Adil, you started this conversation. There are untapped solutions we could be pushing in right now in the short run as we think about the capacity challenge. Then I think, Commissioner, you talked about affordability and reliability, two really important points. And there's a lot of narrative flying around there, but that's something that has to be reconciled. Mm-hmm. And I think, James, what you were talking about in this final point is there's an all-of-the-above strategy to get there, at least in the long run. And we're certainly seeing a lot of momentum in the industry, for example, around nuclear. You mentioned that. And that's kind of where the solution is going. But I think it all comes down to the point, I think, of these 2 days here, which is if you don't get the ecosystem talking the same narrative, it doesn't get solved. We can all sit and think about different angles to this, but it does take this collective push. And I would say this is not just theory. I think in some of the data center deals, and some of the investor deals, we are seeing actually that coalition come together. There's a lot more that needs to be done because back to the challenge, we need to be building 3x the rate to meet the demands that we're expecting to come on board. That would be kind of my synthesis of this, but I really want to thank the Schneider team for having us here. We wanted to start the day today with this going back to the infrastructure, power infrastructure perspective, and I know we'll get to labor later in the day as well. But thanks so much. We have this incredible panel here, hopefully beneficial for everybody to hear the different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.